Welcome back to Catherine's Corner. If this is your first episode, welcome. My name's Sten, and you're listening to a quiet corner of the internet where we talk about our feelings and our thoughts and how we can grow into better humans. Make sure to follow or subscribe to the show wherever you like to listen from to never miss an episode every Friday. And if you want to stay updated on the show, you can join our little community over at Catherine's Corner. Type it into Google, into Instagram, you'll find us. And if you enjoyed the show, let us know by leaving a star rating on it. How you doing? I hope you're doing well. I thought for today I would do a special episode. I did 2 mini podcast episodes for final projects for my classes, and I really liked how they turned out, so I decided I'd share. Plus, I kind of need a break to recover from this semester. So, in the spirit of learning, let's jump into it. The teen girl, the controversial cultural demographic responsible for some of the most pivotal cultural shifts to date. And yet in film, teenage girlhood is often viewed as either frivolous or hypocritical to feminist ideals. But what if the teen girl film might reveal one piece of the larger puzzle of how film can subvert pleasure and its tie to the male gaze? That's why today I want to look at To All the Boys I've Loved Before, a story following 16-year-old Laura Jean Covey as she navigates the chaos that ensues after her gift box full of love letters are sent out to her well-intentioned younger sister. It's a classic, cheesy rom-com with more heart than you'd expect from a Netflix movie. But a large part of why is how it constructs its own understanding of visual pleasures within the film. So let's dive a little bit deeper into this gooey film, shall we? The male gaze, the buzzword of the hour. TikTok has repurposed the gaze to describe the wider patriarchal panopticon, but the male gaze originated as a film term coined by Laura Mulvey in the article Visual Pleasure in the Narrative Cinema. Mulvey notes film's inherent patriarchal functions. A large part of it was conceptualized by men for men, but she also breaks down the male gaze into 2 forms of pleasure: scopophilia, pleasure in looking, and narcissus, which Mulvey explains as the temporary loss of ego while simultaneously reinforcing the ego. And just by those 2 modes, we can see how the male gaze gets, male gazy. The gaze is also broken down into 3 modes: audience to character, camera to character, and character to character. When you have something so male-centric, it quickly morphs non-male figures into a place of other on screen. Mulvey identifies this as the paradox of phallocentrism, the idea of an opposite castrated woman, to juxtapose its purpose, usually centered around a man. The phallus here can be understood more in Freudian ideology, not the literal phallus. And by lacking a phallus, it provides the need for a phallus to be present on screen, while also creating anxiety over those who don't have a phallus not having one. So how is this all tying together? When a non-phallus haver is on screen, they're scrutinized through the look, scopophilia, or controlled and possessed by the protagonist, which is usually a man, hence narcissus. To All the Boys cannot escape this phallic fate, unfortunately. Just within how the genre of film operate, Covey is dressed in a way that draws attention to her, which is best portrayed by the scene with her boots, where she has a standoff with kind of the school bully. There's a lot of anxiety around both the characters, both Covey being called out for having ugly but also cute boots, and the character feeling intimidated by Covey being the center of the gaze.
Not everybody can pull them off. Laura Jean can rock them. But for you, cuz, well...
Let's just say it's probably a good thing you're playing it safe.
With those, Uggs.
More moments of what we could perceive as the male gaze is Covey's hand in the pocket moment as they go through the cafeteria, Covey's fall from grace through the accidental porn sequence that isn't technically porn, but semantics. Yet why does the film still not quite feel like it's being driven by the male gaze? Big hint, it has nothing to do with the so-called female gaze. Part 1 of our answer can be found in Samantha Collins' The Aesthetic Pleasures of Teen Girl Film. Collins looks more at early 00's teen girl films, and most of her arguments fit perfectly for To All the Boys, which frankly pays homage to all its predecessors. According to Calling, a large part of what makes teen girl films of the mass appeal category work has a lot to do with the look. Who would have guessed, considering, film? The look compiles aesthetics, performance elements, and general fanfare into 4 forms of understood visibility: visibility sequences, double coding, pastiche, and contrapposto. We're only going to focus on visibility sequences since the latter 3 concern more aesthetic than gaze. Visibility sequences, according to Calling, can be best understood as the kinds of fun that the girl figure is shown to enjoy, lead up to, or are fundamental moments of visibility: the makeover and catwalk, girl sports, musical, or dance performances. Please note that girl here doesn't mean gender, but more so the essence of what girlhood represents within film. These sequences encapsulate pleasure in every possible way for both character and viewer: tactily, visually, auditorially, which is why it's read as shallow. In the OOs, it was Paris Hilton worthy excess. But into all the boys, it's more the exchange of glances. The sequences at lunch with all of their peers looking at them as they debut their relationship, her and her beautiful shoes or ugly shoes, it's hard to tell. Even the party, the second time that they debut their relationship, is a moment of visibility. My favorite one though is the ski trip bus ride, where they play with the gaze. First, it's the focus around her bully trying to get with her not boo-boo, and then later, as they're coming back, it's the two of them finally confessing how they actually feel about each other and debuting the realness of their relationship, even if it's not known to the characters within the story.
Hey. You didn't tell anyone about last night, did you?
No, that's just how people act with couples on the ski trip. Hey, I'm tired. Can I use you as a pillow?
But the biggest one of the whole movie, easily, is the letters, which is ironic because we don't consider the letters to being visible per se because it's the written word, but even the fanfare of sending out letters, the way the letters are decorated, the chaos that ensues because of the letters, all has to do with the visibility sequences, a point of being known for the teenage girl. But how does this move against the aforementioned male gaze? Our girl figure gets to revel in these moments of visibility, but she's not trapped by them. We're positioned behind Covey's experiences in a way that blends narcissist with scopophilia. Since Covey is our protagonist, we get a lot of pleasure just gazing at her and her performance. One could argue that these are also still moments of power exchange, which are inhibiting the idea of phallocentrism still, such as, the pleasure in seeing girl-on-girl crime. But the most satisfying moments of the film are when our protagonist relinquishes said power. The end of the film confession, where Covey goes up to her boy and reads a letter that she wrote just for him. It's a white flag moment, and arguably, if pleasure comes from tension, the release of tension through embracing visibility is one way that we can subvert this pleasure. So what does it mean to embrace visibility in film, an art form that's pleasures come from villainizing non-male and oftentimes non-white images? The answer can be found in Anne Anlin Chang's discussion on the idea of shine in film. To understand shine as opposed to the different forms of visibility we know as part of the teen girl film, it's best to remember the OGs of the strategy. Think Anna May Wong and Josephine Baker, who are widely known as early 20th century race beauties. What was their allure? It's kind of in the name, them not being white. So how does this escape the line of fetishism? This is when things get complicated. As Chang explains, one could say that Baker and Wong's particular deployments of light and shine do not avoid primitivist, ethnographic interpretations. Indeed, for most viewers then and now, these women are seen in service of those interpretations. This is partially due to the fact that existing dominant discourses on shine and shininess, i.e. Marxism and psychoanalysis, reinforce such interpretation. As Marx and Freud would tell us, shine is the lure of commodity or sexual fetishism. But my point is that these theoretical frameworks have also blinded us to the alternative workings and the effects of shine. These alternatives that Chang cares about is shine's ability to turn the gaze in on itself. Chang discusses this with Tom Hollert, using the story of Lacan's sardine can. The can is both visible in the sense of its presence being known, but invisible to the eyes of the viewer. As Chang puts it, think of the sardine can and the notion of the gaze that it dramatizes as not a corrective or redemptive moment per se, but as a provocation, a call to an ethical encounter. The metaphor of this can, in short, forces us to break down the mechanics of gaze again. Instead of audience, camera, character, we move into seer, scene, in the gaze itself. Here, in this metaphor, the gaze is the can, an agent without any agency, or the ethical encounter, as Chang puts it. Who else is an agent without agency? Marginalized bodies on screen that are deprivileged under the standard male gaze. Chang brings in these questions. What does agency look like in a crisis of consent? Can we think about agency when the human subject is in question? Chang is pointing out an important reality here. You can't just strip away the male gaze. Under the functions of film, it is impossible to escape. This leaves those that film will naturally scrutinize to essentially negotiate their agency. When considering figures like Baker and Wong, Chang says the counter-imagination that you elegantly identify is not a set of prescriptive strategies on the part of the woman in question, but a complex interaction produced at the intersections of performer, performance, medium, and the practice of reading. So why the hell consider this when looking at a film like To All the Boys? Well, teen girl film works under the mechanics of the shine negotiation. The pleasure of visibility is how the performer, teen girl, or in our case, Cubby, performs girlhood under the medium of both film itself and the teen girl genre. How we read this dynamic is how the mechanics of the male gaze become unstable. The pleasure in watching Laura Jean have her teen girl moments doesn't just come from those visibility moments centered to the genre, but by an extension, all aspects of the performance of girlhood. This includes watching reruns with her sister, the sequences of swooning both over her crush and her new boo, the aesthetics of her clothes in her room, her fantasy sequences, even her moments of humiliation are all performance of the affect that is teenage girlhood. This complicates Covey's ability to be our narcissist protagonist. She becomes our sardine can, both visible and invisible. By being the embodiment of shine in a genre that succeeds through the centering of visibility, viewers are left to consider their own affect in the performance of girl. If I feel how Covey feels, or feel anything while watching this movie, I'm reeled into examining myself further. Or not. In Collings' analysis of the teen girl film, she emphasizes the emptiness within the genre, and that's what makes the genre pleasurable. We're not meant to possess any part of the experience of watching To All the Boys, including pleasure itself. As Colling writes, pleasure is the intended physical consequence of positive feel-good impressions and affects. It is not one type of feeling, affect, or emotion. It can be experienced in many forms: joy, satisfaction, arousal, and excitement. For example, the connection between them being that these pleasures feel good and are inextricable from the body. When a movie like To All the Boys leaves little room for projection and operates only on the scopophilic satisfaction of spectacle, the mechanics of the male gaze become perverted. The gaze shifts from being a tool to interrogate the other into a tool to interrogate ourselves, if we so choose to. And what is less patriarchal than choosing to investigate? Multiracial identity, the unspoken marker of the Americas. Today we're going to focus on multiracial Americans specifically through the lens of psychology, or more accurately, we're going to look at how psychology loses a lot of information with how it chooses to study this specific demographic, which honestly is the mark of a much larger issue within the field of psychology. Since this topic is really dense, I thought I'd go through and share some of the highlights of my research and share some personal reflections as well. So the first big point I have here is that psychology's focus around development and social dynamics can provide key information to understanding the multiracial experience on a quantitative and qualitative level. Despite spending this semester examining the different effects that our society kind of has on multiracial people and how they understand their identity, I did not fully process how much monoraciality is really, really rough on understanding one's own identity when you come from a plethora of them. So for multiracial people, what psychology has been able to assess, a big part of how it shows up for them is in what has been coined as identity-based challenges. For multiracial people, because they come from so many different identities, and our culture, which is a monoracial culture, only understands identity in terms of very specific categories, it makes it harder for one to have a quote-unquote strong racial identity because they don't really fit into any of the dichotomies of how we understand race. So when I was doing my research, I thought the best way to really understand the topics coming up was to look at a first account from Elizabeth Mickey Brina's memoir, Speak Okinawa, where she talks about her coming of age, growing up as part Okinawan and part white within America, specifically a very white area within America. And one of the things that I pointed out within this part of my research that she shares is when she first remembered the tension between her Okinawan identity and her American identity. And that was when her mother and her returned from living in Okinawa for a prolonged period of time. And at the time, the author Brina was able to speak Japanese fluently and has since grown out of it. And a large part of why she lost her Japanese was because coming back to the States, you're surrounded by English and you're encouraged to assimilate. This tension in just trying to find a place to fit internally causes a dissonance in how they're even able to understand how they're interpreted, both in terms of society and how they interpret themselves. Because at the end of the day, everyone just wants an in. And within a lot of societies around the world, what is coined as a monoracial paradigm within the research that I did that governs a monocentric society in which race is constructed in immutable and rigid categories, makes it very difficult for anyone who doesn't fit into these categories that are rigid and immutable to be able to figure out how to get themselves to fit anywhere, because it isn't comfortable to fit yourself in the margins either. The second big thing that I found within my research, which is a continuation of the same idea, is that because of these internal challenges that multiracial people face, especially during those key moments in development, which within psychology, if you're familiar with a lot of psych research, we love to look at development. Development is kind of the key point into how we understand a lot of what's going on with people socially and internally and interpersonally. Because of those internal challenges, multiracial people specifically will face stressors that are very specific to their identity that people who aren't multiracial will not experience. But for whatever reason within a lot of psych research, unless we were focusing specifically on the multiracial demographic, and even that is very tricky, which I'll get into more later, it's overlooked very often. Within one study I found, which was a study that was encouraging more researchers to consider multiracial identity in their research and even have the research focus specifically on multiracial identity. These researchers identified 3 specific stressors, one being varied cultural backgrounds between parents, marginalized status within the monoracial paradigm, and consistent underrepresentation demographically. And looking at this, I kind of interpreted it as a larger umbrella of multiracial discrimination, which a different research paper looked at. They defined multiracial discrimination through a very similar set of stressors: negative treatment based on assumed racial ethnic group membership inferred from their phenotype, unfair treatment targeted at the actual racial ethnic group or groups to which they belong, alongside further discrimination for existing outside of this monoracial paradigm. When considering these things as far as specific stressors that only multiracial people will really experience, it kind of reminded me of a similar conversation happening around how we factor in culture into our reading of psych phenomenons for other marginalized monoracial populations like the Black population and the Asian population, which even that, both of those are very tricky and require a lot of nuance. For example, considering how anxiety can be interpreted in Black populations compared to white populations, and considering the cultural phenomenons around that and the societal dynamics around that and even the histories around that, which psych research currently, while it is moving forward towards that in certain aspects, really struggles to do because we are not very intersectional in our analysis. I know psych is considering the idea of generational and somatic trauma more as we take different angles of researching things like psychopathology, for example, which is just a fancy way of saying mental illness. But I think there's still a gap over culture influencing generational trauma and genetic/family systems and how we think about generational trauma within psychology. While it all plays in, while like the dynamic a family has and how it is carried on and how it evolves because of how it is carried on is a big part of generational trauma, and even certain disorders being passed on genetically through families also being explained through generational trauma because of the way these families have operated. I think it's really silly to forget about how much history plays into this as well, which is something that Brina's book is frameworked around. It's this idea of kind of reckoning with history, both her family history, American history, and Okinawan history, and the overlaps between those. Because at the beginning of the book, she talks about, this is a quote, "I believe," referring to trauma, "they stay in our bodies. As sickness, as addiction, as poor posture or a tendency toward apology, as a deepened capacity for sadness or anger." And she goes on to elaborate, concluding that all these experiences that are passed down through history form who we are. And it is something within cultural studies that has been looked at a bit more closely, and there are psych studies that are considering this in a very roundabout way. One study I found looked at Korean adoptee mothers that are preparing to raise specifically half white and half Asian children, which, what a specific, imperfect study for this specific topic to look at, because they hit on both the topic of multiracial identity and how generational trauma isn't just family specific, it's also culturally and politically specific, because these adoptees, their experiences are shaped by the experience of being adopted into a Western family. And their adoption is the cause of these big political factors like the Korean War, which, similarly to the Vietnam War, you have a lot of Americans around that are fraternizing with Korean people in this way there are political dynamics going on there as well as more specific interpersonal dynamics. But then you do have like a lot of children that are mixed race that will not be accepted into Korean society because of that monoracial paradigm again, and that idea of purity and family lineage and etc., and honor and etc. So they're brought here in a pursuit to give them a better life. Again, all being influenced by history and politics. And that's shaping a very specific personal and cultural experience for them that is specific to being a Korean adoptee within America. And then because of these experiences that they're having, being in this Western context as people who do not come from Western countries and are now having to kind of force themselves to fit in whatever way they can, even though the West sees them as an other. This is going to shape how they approach parenting, which is something that's brought up within the study. A lot of these Korean adoptee mothers are very intent on making sure that their children grow up with cultural connection, because their cultural connection was cut off. And that connection was cut off because of the politics that drove them to being adoptees in the first place. So I think considering this version of generational trauma, or weaving this understanding of generational trauma with the genetic and family systems idea that's already present in psychology, is really important. So it's having a deeper understanding in our research and having a deeper understanding as to why people are the way they are. And I think psych, similar to other STEM disciplines, really struggles with integrating politics and culture in this way, because there's a sense of, oh, maybe it'll be less objective, which isn't quite true, because you're losing a lot of context when you're not considering these things. And even within the study, the whole Korean War aspects of why there's a phenomenon of Korean adoptees within Western society was almost glossed over. It was more like a footnote at the beginning of the study and wasn't analyzed in depth with how they were interpreting their results from the study. So when looking at all these different holes within psychological research for this demographic of multiracial people, and honestly marginalized people at large, but specifically multiracial people and what that looks like and how that plays out, I proposed one solution, or one version of a solution, towards kind of solving a lot of these gaps in information that we have. Simply put, it's just an intersectional approach to studying versus the more quote-unquote objective approach psychology tends to have, to where we are just looking at the facts. We're just looking at the data. We're not taking a political take on the data. We're not going to impose any ideas on the data. Instead of doing that, using what we do know from the studies that we do have, even investigating said information further from the studies that we do have, and interpreting our data that way so that we're not losing information. And I think it can also, which I didn't get as into within my research, I think it can also be flipped in reverse to where our research is informed by this intersectional lens. So one example of what I mean here was looking at peer interaction development for multiracial people specifically. In a study that was done on peer interaction development, multiracial individuals seem to connect with different monoracial groups more often than their monoracial peers would, and they were also more likely to marry another multiracial individual compared to their monoracial peers. So if we were to consider the specific things associated with the multiracial experience, from the different stressors to the historical context around multiracial identity, then we can investigate looking at if the bridging happening is a benefit to said individuals, or if it is an added social stressor for them, or if it's even a behavior that's just part of multiracial social development that is very different from monoracial social development. Again, because you're having to move between these different identities, because you don't really fit into one in a society that wants you to fit into one. So this may be a strategy that's developed to kind of curb that stressor of not fitting into one category. So when I talk through it, it feels so simple and almost natural to analyze it this way, not just through quantitative research, but psych really struggles to look at quantitative research more qualitatively and look at it within a context that isn't just straight data. Ironically enough, for a field like psychology that is about people, we forget that we're looking at people who are experiencing society actively, and therefore you can't always be objective in how you are analyzing something. The multiracial experience is a very subjective experience, and I don't think we lose validity in our research by allowing a certain level of subjectivity in our analysis. If anything, I think it can add more depth to research, and for me, it's allowed me to take a more critical approach to how I interpret things within psychology and phenomenons within psychology. And I know psychology is trying to move into a biopsychosocial space, but I think really considering the cultural aspects of our research could do wonders. I hope you enjoyed those special episodes. I had a lot of fun making them, and I feel like I really learned a lot and got to reflect. But now, it's time that we breathe. In, 2, 3, 4. Hold, 2, 3, 4. Out, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. In, 2, 3, 4. Hold, 2, 3, 4. Out, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. In, 2, 3, 4. Hold, 2, 3, 4. Out, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Before you go, remember to follow or subscribe wherever you like to listen from to receive future episodes. This podcast is available to listen to on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Anchor FM, Stitcher, and more. And if you want to stay updated on the show, you can join our little community over at Catherine's Corner. You're amazing and you're doing what you can. Please take care of yourself, and I'll see you here next time on Catherine's Corner.